Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Staub. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm going to call this committee to study the impact of the housing crisis on people with disabilities to order. And I would invite my two colleagues to introduce themselves. Why don't you begin, Senator?
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Denise Ricciardi and State Senator for District 9, and I'm so thrilled to be part of this very important committee and have sponsored this bill in the Senate.
And Representative Jessica LaMontagne from Dover. And I'm glad to be here working on this committee also. Thanks.
Yes, and you're the clerk. Yes.
And I'm the clerk.
Okay, so we have something new today. The meeting is being recorded, and it's being broadcast so that people who are unable to make it can. You want me to pull that forward a little bit? How about that? People who are unable to make it are still able to follow along with what's happening in the. Do we have here's an extra? Okay. Follow along with what we're doing. Speaking from experience, all I have to say is that if you're in the witness protection program, or you don't want people seeing the faces that you make when somebody says something you don't agree with, then don't sit right behind the speaker, because I've done that and regretted it when I watched the replay. All right, and we have, whoops, can I have that thing over here? All right, yeah, there we go. Representative, would you introduce yourself? We're on TV today.
Yeah, sure. My name is Representative Josh O'Kella. I am representing Rockingham 32 districts of includes Fremont, Danville, and Brentwood.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have we don't have a lot of people presenting today, but we have a big presentation from New Hampshire Housing. So I would invite you to come forward and let's hear what you have to say, and hopefully you'll be able to answer some of our questions, because we have a lot. Do you want to bring extra chairs up? Go right ahead if you all want to do this.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be back. I was with the committee for your second meeting.
Okay.
And spoke with you and answered some questions.
Yeah. Can you please state your names for the clerk?
Sure. For the record, my name is Jack Ruderman, Energy and Legislative Affairs Advisor at New Hampshire Housing. And with me today are my colleagues, Ignatius McClellan, who is the Managing Director of our Multifamily Housing Division, and Dee Pouliot, who is the Managing Director of the Assisted Housing Division. As I was saying at the last meeting that I attended, I provided as much information as I could on the questions that were on the committee's mind, but there were questions relating to multifamily housing and also housing choice vouchers that were sort of beyond, not in my wheelhouse. And so we promised to come back with people who could give you more details on those questions. So I guess I would just kick it off by asking, which would you like to hear about first?
The multifamily or the housing choice or the vouchers? What's your pleasure?
The vouchers.
Okay, yes, vouchers, please.
Okay, so
Okay. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So New Hampshire Housing administers the federal HUD Housing Choice Voucher Program. We are one of 18 local housing authorities in this state who also administer the Housing Choice Voucher Program. A couple of the questions that Jack had asked me about are the total number of vouchers in the state. And there are 11,297 total vouchers in the state administered by those, like the local housing authorities. New Hampshire Housing We have just over 4,000 vouchers that we administer. And we have a budget from HUD of about $50 million to administer those vouchers. The total money that comes to the state, the 2024 calendar year statewide budget authority from HUD was $127.4 million that comes to the state for each housing authority to administer its voucher program.
Thank you.
Of our voucher participants at New Hampshire Housing, I don't have the other housing authority numbers because they're all independent housing authorities. But at New Hampshire Housing, 78% of our voucher holders are 62 years of age or older or have a disability. About 10% are elderly and 68% are persons with a disability. On our waiting list, we have just under 12,000 applicants on the waiting list, and 6,300 of those are elderly or have a disability. The bulk, over 4,000, are persons with a disability waiting for a voucher. Yep.
Do you have those? Can you send those numbers to us in the email? It
Yes.
will make it a lot easier for us. Thank you.
Sure.
But thank you. Go ahead.
The estimated wait time for the majority of applicants on the waiting list is 6 to 8 years. It's probably going up. We do have, HUD allows each housing authority to set its preferences and priority of your waiting list. At New Hampshire Housing, we have 2 priority preferences, and that wait time is now running about 1 to 2 years. And those priority preferences are for an applicant with a terminal illness or an applicant who is eligible for one of the 4 Medicaid waiver programs. And that wait time is about 1 to 2 years right now. We only can pull from the waiting list as vouchers become available. So it's all based on attrition. And the attrition right now is very low. All our vouchers are in use. Attrition's very low. As people go off the program, we can add new households from the waiting list. New Hampshire Housing is one of a couple other housing authorities in New Hampshire. We are what HUD calls, we're in shortfall. The rents are so high, some of the rents are so high that we have to live within our, I'm going to say, $50 million budget. So as our average subsidy cost goes up, we have to serve less or start to just slow down. We don't anticipate pulling from the waiting list through the rest of this calendar year, which will only increase the wait times for the majority of applicants on the waiting list.
Is that
It-
okay?
yeah, unless there are any,
Um,
happy to answer questions.
yeah, go ahead, Senator Ricciardi.
I have 2 questions. I just want to make sure that I'm clear on something you said. A terminally ill person has a 2-year wait. I mean,
1 to 2 years right now because of the funding situation we're in. Prior years, it was less than a month. We were pulling every month. We're just in, HUD. It's just based on our HUD funding. We're dependent on the HUD budget.
follow up.
Go ahead.
So, in a perfect world, how would you suggest fixing this?
Well, the HUD budget is based on congressional appropriations. We haven't seen basically many new vouchers appropriated through Congress. Last year, we received some vouchers for veterans. The HUD has what they call special purpose vouchers, so you can compete and apply for vouchers as they become available as appropriated through Congress.
So, as a state, you have to talk to the federal delegation to ask for them to do something.
Correct. It's federally funded, dependent on the federal program.
Reach out now. It's an election year.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay. Representative Yokella.
Hi, thank you. So I assume that the waiting list is a statewide list, and not each of the 18 agencies have their own list, right? And so how, or do you
No,
each?
that's just New Hampshire Housing's waiting list. Each housing authority in addition has its own waiting list. We may have the same applicants on each other's list, but Nashua, Manchester, each housing authority has its own waiting list.
Okay. So you have 12,000 waiting on your list, but that's not the entire,
That's just us, yes.
that's just you.
Yeah. We work statewide, so when I say the statewide waiting list, because we operate statewide.
So how are the 11,000 vouchers kind of divvied up? Is it equally, but well, I assume it can't be equally since you have almost like a third of all of the vouchers. So how is that kind of divvied up, and so the people on your waiting list are waiting for one of your vouchers that are currently assigned to someone to be not utilized anymore?
Right, so HUD allows us to set, each housing authority to set its own preference system. So like I said, we have the 2 higher preferences. And then our next group, which we're going to say is the 6 to 8 year group, that is for applicants who are homeless, pay more than 50% of their income for rent, living in substandard housing, victims of domestic violence, or veterans. That's the bulk of the waiting list. That's the bulk. It's probably 8,000 or 9,000 applicants and that. And then the rest of the applicants don't have a preference. They don't meet any of the above.
Okay. Go ahead.
So, your choices for preferences, those aren't a statewide thing, right? So the 18 other or 17 other agencies could have other preferences.
Yes.
are you-
Most
are
have
you-
got, I'm sorry.
Are you aware of what any of those preferences are? Are there a variety, or do you believe that they're pretty much the same?
Just in speaking with them, and we all have to have a HUD approved administrative plan, and it's a public document, so they all could be looked up. From what I hear from the other housing authorities, they have simplified their preference system to, some have done away with preferences. The local housing authorities often have a residency preference, that you come before somebody who, if you live in Nashua, you might come before somebody who doesn't live in Nashua. They can have a residency preference. HUD allows that. Some of the housing authorities, they've tried to simplify their preferences, I would say, but they could be similar to ours. The other little kind of information of the preferences, regardless of the preferences, HUD requires that 75% of the turnover vouchers each year go to applicants who are extremely low income. And those are applicants who are at 30% or below of the area median income limit. So regardless of the preference, you still have to meet that mandatory targeting on your turnover vouchers. So it's basically, it sort of acts like a preference at times. So, and I know that Concord, Dover, maybe Somersworth, they have closed their waiting list because the list becomes so long. They have closed it to new applicants.
Go ahead, Representative Lamontagne.
And could you explain, you said that one of your other priorities are those eligible for the waiver program.
Mm-hmm.
And how do those 2 programs work together, the voucher with the waiver program?
It gives them a preference. So if they're eligible and receiving services on one of the 4 Medicaid waiver programs, which is Choices for Independence, nursing home eligible care, developmentally disabled, brain injury, home support for children. Those 4 Medicaid waivers, they're just equal status. So it's date of application and their Medicaid waiver eligibility form.
Okay, so it's just a status that they're
Yeah,
eligible.
so they get a
and that
higher weight
okay.
on the waiting list. Right now, just for that preference, there are over 300 applicants on the waiting list claiming one of those Medicaid waiver programs.
Okay, I have a question. Where can we get a list of the 18 other agencies?
We can send that to you.
Thank you.
It's on our
very-
website as
All
well,
right,
but we'll
okay,
make it
thank
easy
you.
and send that
All
to
right,
you.
Thank you.
You take it.
The other question that I'd like you to address is that, can you give us, there may be people that watch this who are unfamiliar with how the vouchers work. And my understanding is that there are the housing choice vouchers, which you can use to get an apartment in a private building, and the federal government subsidizes your rent. But then there are other vouchers that are specific to a unit. And how do those work? And when we're talking about people with disabilities, how, do you see that we need, how successful are people at getting suitable apartments using either housing choice vouchers or those vouchers that are
The Section 8. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, right? And HUD tried to move away from Section 8 and call it the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but its brand name is still Section 8 is easy. And with the voucher program, it's exactly what you said. Once you get your voucher, you go search for an apartment. We help with the housing search, but it's the voucher holder's responsibility to find an apartment, or they can use it to purchase a home. They can rent a manufactured home, an apartment, a duplex, an apartment that has to be suitable for occupancy, be within our rent limits, and pass a minimum housing quality inspection standard. And they lease up in that apartment, and we work with those landlords.
okay.
We have had, we've been able to lease all our vouchers, so it really has not been a problem,
Okay.
the lease up. On the Section 8, so we call a voucher a tenant-based program where the tenant has the subsidy and the tenant chooses where they want to live. The other program you're describing is really an Ignatius's shop, but it's project-based. It's the Section 8 project-based program where HUD gives those contracts to the property. And Ignatius's team, they manage those contracts, but it's project-based. So if you want to move, you can't take the subsidy with you.
Right.
Where a voucher, you can take it to Florida. We have participants, they could go all over the country. It's transferable. So there's this move option that some people prefer to have the choice.
Okay. All right. Okay. Can I ask, like, we're mostly interested in, and this may be not specific to the voucher system, but I know that New Hampshire Housing also does a lot of data collection on rent rates and et cetera. And I just wonder, do you maintain any data of like how many people with disabilities are using these vouchers? And well, you've given us some, but how many do we have? Say project based. How many do we have? How many could we use? And what are the I don't know, what are the incentives for actually building properties that will accommodate people who have physical disabilities or other disabilities?
So we're really without the voucher. There were no new Section 8 contracts. HUD ended that program in the early 80s, 1980s, ended that program. So there were no new project-based contracts.
Oh, okay.
So with the vouchers, any housing that New Hampshire Housing develops and finances, the owner of that property cannot say no to vouchers. So
Okay.
voucher holders can certainly go into any housing financed and administered by New Hampshire Housing.
All right. Representative Lamontagne.
Do you think that HUD would consider project-based ones if it was only a portion of the building that's set aside for people with disabilities, say, in which they weren't creating a whole building for,
Yep, I guess I should have clarified a little bit more on that project base. You can project base vouchers. So we actually are allowed by HUD to take some of our vouchers and project base them in one of those properties. And we have done that. So we can project base, we cannot project base vouchers for a specific disability. It would be a violation of fair housing. So it might be people with disabilities they can apply and come from our waiting list and go into those properties, but we wouldn't necessarily have a project-based vouchers for a specific disability carved out in a project.
Representative Yokela?
Yes, thank you. It seemed like there was some where that I had heard that if someone got a voucher, that they had trouble finding housing in New Hampshire that would meet it. But then you also stated that all of them are leased. And so I guess my question is, how many of them, well, I guess it's kind of twofold. How many structures do you believe are currently, let's say, on the market that fall within your rent cap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, how many of the people, if any, have you seen not be able to find housing, and they're out in their time frame that they're allowed to find it and have to surrender it?
So those are great questions. I don't know how many buildings or properties we have vouchers in. We have 2,100 landlords for the 4,000 or so vouchers. So we have, large properties with multiple voucher participants in it. So we have 2,100 landlords, and the success rate, which is also measured by HUD, how many vouchers does it take to get one lease up? And the success rate is about 70%. So all our vouchers are in use, but that's because we might issue 3 vouchers. We might notify 3 people from the waiting list for 1 voucher, knowing that 2 may not be eligible or successful within their housing search time. So they have 120 days, and then they can ask for an extension if they need more time. But not everybody is successful. Either the voucher could expire or they give up, or they don't find anything. It could be we work with each voucher holder to track the barriers. So what is preventing them from leasing up? Is it credit? Is it criminal record? Is it they need a first floor? They need a 1-bedroom? They have a service animal? All the reasons that we work with them through those barriers to want them to be successful with their voucher lease up. But it's not 100% successful.
So I'm interested in if you're tracking that let's say that the property is not useful. Like we've heard a lot about like universal design and stuff like that, about it doesn't meet their needs as far as they're disabled and they can't, whether it be first floor or some other, curbless shower or something like that needs, that the person would need. If you're tracking those, and if they have more.
No, we don't track them. We know, like in the properties financed by New Hampshire Housing, we know properties financed by New Hampshire Housing have accessible units in them.
Right.
So we would refer them to apply to these specific properties where we know they might have units that meet their needs. They also, in the private market, they could make those modifications, work with the landlord to make those modifications, but we only would know those that we have it as a barrier that they're, looking for a unit that they need that is accessible and barrier free, we would refer them to the list of apartments we know about.
Okay. And for someone, you notify 3 people for a single voucher. And I guess if the 2 people that are not successful in the 120 days, do they go back on the waiting list and they get notified again? What, do they start the search over again? Or are they just off of the list and go back to the end of the line and start their 6-year wait over again?
All that. If they're actively looking and get an extension, we're very generous with extensions. You can get extension as long as we have a voucher available, and through attrition we usually can, but they have to be actively looking in their housing search because it's holding up another slot. In the event that either they go away or we don't hear from them for several weeks or a month, we inactivate their status, and then they would have to reapply and go back to the bottom of the list.
As a follow-up on that, what if you notify 3 people that there's a voucher available and 2 of them are successful in finding apartments?
Yeah,
Then what do you do?
We would like all 3 to be accessible, because then we have a forecasting tool, and we're in the next month we look at attrition and we decide how many slots do we have, and then we say, oh, how many leased up, how many didn't, how many are searching. So every month we have a forecasting tool that takes us through, so we know maybe this month we pulled 10 people or 20 people, or no one was successful. Sometimes they're already living in there where they want to stay. They're in place, so that's easy. So we can count on that right away in our forecasting. So it's always looking at who went on, who went off, and balancing it. HUD gives us the whole calendar year. So as long as at the end of the calendar year we don't exceed our voucher count, you kind of have some wiggle room. If you're a little high one month, you use through attrition, you'll balance yourself out.
Okay. And from what I understand, HUD uses the area median rent, or they develop some sort of a formula for what they consider an acceptable price to pay for an apartment. Do you have how does that compare with what landlords are actually charging?
So HUD publishes its fair market rents each year, effective October 1st. They were just published last month for October 1st. And housing authorities have 90 days to set what HUD calls a payment standard. That's our subsidy standard. So we have a fair market rent. We compare it to the rent study that you were talking about, that New Hampshire Housing completes each year, a rent study. We compare it to the low-income housing tax credit program rent. So we're looking to see what is the comparable market rent. And HUD gives the housing authority, we have the permission to set that between 80 and 120%. We have a waiver to 120%. Some housing authorities can only go to 110%, but we have that flexibility to set that as we're trying to set it close to market. Because if we find our success rate dropping, we look at the rents. And then we want to know, why aren't they leasing up? HUD only pays us if they lease up. So it doesn't do us any good to have a lot of voucher holders searching and they're unable to lease up. So we're looking at what are the barriers. Again, if rent's a barrier, then, and we can go, in some cases, we can go over 120% of the fair market rent as a reasonable accommodation for an applicant with a disability. We have to get approval from HUD Washington.
Okay. All right. So what you're saying is, like, if HUD says is $1,200 a month, say, is an acceptable rent, you're able to go 20% above that and have a voucher that would accommodate that level of rent. Okay.
And we're always trying to do that within that $50 million budget. So we can't give everybody 120%. We wouldn't have enough money. So we're looking at we're trying to set our payment standards close to market rents that are reasonable.
Can you, before we let you go, others may have other questions, but who are the people that are coming looking for vouchers?
So our waiting list is made up mostly with people with disability, elderly, or they're on the list so long they become elderly. Families with children are really, I would say, applicants with a disability make up use most of the vouchers and make up most of the waiting list.
And how do they come to you?
Oh, sorry. They can apply through our website. They work with a lot of the area agencies, or working with, if they're applying for city benefits, welfare benefits, they may ask them, refer them to the local housing authority as well as ours. And the same with us. If someone calls us, they apply with us, but we may also say apply with the local housing authority. You can apply with more than one.
Okay. Okay. All right. Representative Lamontagne and then Representative Yocella.
Do the private property owners
I've been looking
that
forward
rent to these
poke
vouchers,
me
do they
in the
also
press.
get a tax credit for doing that?
Not under the voucher program, no.
Okay.
And Representative Yocella?
Well, if the city does one, it's not through us.
Yeah.
We wouldn't know about it. If the town or city offers some tax incentive, we wouldn't know about it.
But as far as you know, they don't get a federal tax
No,
credit
no,
or a state.
no, not federal for the voucher program. No tax.
Go ahead.
So we had a number of people. Well, you said 300 people are able to accept one of these waivers that are on the waiting list. So
We have
300 out of
300
the
applicants
11,000.
waiting, yes.
I'm just but you said that there's a significant portion of the people are either using or on the waiting list are disabled. Do you have any information about whether it's an intellectual or physical disability, or I guess that, yeah, because there seems to be a lot of 300 just seems small as out of 11,000. If
300 for us is high on that Medicaid waiver.
yeah,
But it could be small, but that's just under those Medicaid waiver. That's just really
Yeah.
a Medicaid waiver. And that mostly, when they come to the top, it's usually under the DD waiver, for developmentally disabled. It's usually that waiver program.
Right.
But everybody else on the waiting list that says they're disabled, by law, we can't ask. We don't know the nature of their disability. So it could be just they receive SSDI.
right. We've been getting a lot of statistics, and a lot of them are specifically saying like developmentally disabled people are in the statistics and not essentially all disabled people. And so it seems like your numbers are more going to be in the everyone category and not specifically broken out as far as developmentally versus physically disabled.
Right. The only one we would know is if it's a Medicaid waiver. It's the
Okay.
only disability we know because they come under that waiver program.
All right. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Do we have any more questions for? I'd like to hear from Mr. McClellan now about the slide the about what your milieu is.
All right,
and-
good afternoon. So I'm Ignatius McClellan. I'm the Managing Director of the Multifamily Housing Team at New Hampshire Housing. I'll leave my card for the spelling on my way out. So the Multifamily Housing Team runs the housing finance programs for new production and the housing finance programs for purchase, rehabilitation, or just straight recapitalization and rehabilitation. And we do that primarily using the federal programs of the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the Home Partnership Program, Housing Trust Fund, and the State Affordable Housing Fund, and recently the Invest in H money through BEA. We've worked with BEA very closely to get their funds into a lot of the new production that we have been part of.
BEA, please.
Business and Economic Affairs,
Okay.
Taylor Caswell and his team. And what I wrote down, just so you don't have to keep all the notes, after this meeting, we will send you a grid that explains the programs.
Okay.
We'll send you our annual report, and we'll send you our program plan, which if you just look at the multifamily information, and Dee's information will be in there. It'll give you a good overview. So I only prepared notes because once you take a step into housing finance, it has so many layers of complexity. But think about it, when you go for production, we have a production program using the 9% federal low-income housing tax credit program, which is simple and complicated. It gets private investors to put money into the housing in exchange for long-term tax credits and other tax benefits. And then the home program, the Housing Trust Fund program, and then, as I said, the State Affordable Housing Fund, and then the Invest in H funds. And then there's also debt associated with the projects depending on which tax credit program. So the 9%, simple way to think about it, the 9% low-income housing tax credit program is designed that the tax credits would provide 70% of the cost of land acquisition, engineering, approval, and actually building the property. And then we have a 4% tax credit program where 30% of the cost to do all of that is from the tax credits. The challenge is that these all come with rental restrictions that are long-term. So the shortest that we do now, we do some 30-year, but they're primarily 45 years and 60 years that bring income and rent restrictions, which means the properties cannot support a lot of debt. So if I'm doing market, I'm going to put some money down. I'm going to borrow most of the money because I can charge the residents what the market will allow. The whole premise of our programs are you limit the rent amount and or the income amount, which therefore means you can't build it unless you have what they call the capital stack. And so you can look at a transaction that might have 5 different sources in it. So it might have tax credits, home, HTF, affordable housing, BEA, and each one of those, you should know, comes with their own requirements. So on the production side, our goal for both production and preservation example, Concord Rural Gardens up on the Heights, 300 units, had not really been improved for quite a while. We did a major purchase and recapitalization where they're gutting the apartments and bringing them up to more current standards. But we'll do about 1,000 to 1,200 units on both the new production and the purchase and rehabilitation side. And the reason we do a limited number is because the subsidies are limited. We get a certain allocation from the state, we get a certain allocation from the Fed. And so we then provide those resources through competitive processes. So on the low-income housing tax credit side, on the 9%, we have a thing called the Qualified Allocation Plan, the QAP, and that sets out the priorities based on New Hampshire housing priorities, but also priorities from the public. So we release the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, and we go through quite a process in that. Same thing on the 4% tax credit side. We have a notice of funding opportunity, and then we do operate a separate supportive housing standalone program, which is a rather small program because we cannot use the federal money in disability specific housing because as my colleague Dee indicated, fair housing has some very significant restrictions on what we can do with HUD resources. You should know that we have spent quite a time banging on HUD's door to say if they could read their regulations in a different way, and they have not been willing to do that, even though the regulation says that we should be able to put forward a fair housing plan to do some specific disability housing, but we cannot. And it puts a restriction on both the capital resources and, as Dee also indicated, on what we can do in terms of vouchers. So in terms of housing for the disabled, I would say a couple things. One, we have certain minimums for ADA, Americans with Disability Act compliance. In the competitive process, if they agree, the developer agrees to do more units, we will provide them with more points, which allows them to score, and they chase the points and the like. That said, the numbers have to work, and I'm going to talk about rental assistance because if you built everything without any debt, it still will cost $500 to $700 a month to maintain an apartment with insurance, maintenance, utilities, upkeep, and the like. So even if you put somebody into an apartment that was completely subsidized, there are still long-term carrying costs. And as Dee indicated, a lot of the folks who are on disability, they're making $18,000 a year, and even a third of that isn't going to really support what you need to carry it. I will say that within our programs, we have this approach of integration is one of our number one approaches in terms of housing for the disabled. And it could be disabled folks, could be folks from homeless, it could be income. And again, we lay out, okay, you get points if you try to serve these different populations. And then the overlay is you don't want folks just living integrated if there aren't services, if they need services. So part of what we do, if somebody gets points for some of these categories, we ask what's your service plan so that people are successful, because that's what everybody wants, is them to be successful. Now, we do some standalone supportive housing. We're just about to go to our board with the notice of funding opportunity for supportive housing, but it's small dollars, relatively speaking. This year, it's $1.5 million to $2 million, which is not a lot of money. And that's because we can only use the state dollars. Fair housing won't let us use the federal dollars. And that has been a challenge because there are a lot of really good organizations trying to build that disability specific housing, but we cannot get past the HUD fair housing requirement. Let me just go through my notes. The other thing that, to go to Representative Lamontagne's question about tax credits, the complicated answer is it is possible that somebody is getting tax credits. Developer comes in, wants to do a 9% tax credit deal. They have agreed as part of that they'll accept folks with disabilities, they'll accept folks with vouchers, so they're not directly, because of that, getting the tax credit. They're getting the tax credits as part of the development. And what we're trying to do is this holistic housing. How do we take all of these different pieces? So as Dee indicated, housing choice vouchers have to be accepted in our properties. We do some project-based vouchers. I'll give you a good example. Housing Trust Fund, which is profits from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. You have to serve folks at 30% area median income. They won't even be able to, cover the rent. And so in that case, you need to put vouchers into those deals so that the apartment will generate enough rent in order to carry the apartment cost. And then one other program that New Hampshire should be very proud of is a HUD program called Section 811. Project-based rental assistance. This is a partnership between New Hampshire Housing and the State Department of Health and Human Services, where folks with severe mental illness are able to get a unit within one of our projects. So it's the same thing. if you'll put an 811 unit in your project, you'll get a certain number of points. So that's our encouragement and integration approach. I think we have, and I'll get the number wrong, I think it's 247 currently are out there in the universe. We just applied to HUD. Unfortunately, they changed how many we could apply for, but we did get 50 more. And they're small numbers, but for individuals with severe mental illness and for their families, it's something I think we're very proud of. So I think that's about it. You know, we have limited resources. We distribute them through competitive processes. We try our best to include the disabled as part of that policy, but it's always being balanced against the fact that New Hampshire is in a severe housing crisis. And I will tell you that today, a 2-bedroom, 900 square foot apartment probably has a total development cost of $350,000 to $370,000. And so that's why it takes a lot of capital subsidy to get an apartment that you then have to rent to lower moderate income people. So.
Okay, Senator first. We have-
Thank you for giving us this presentation. I have a few things I'm trying to understand. So, you know, we're tasked to find solutions to this problem, which it's very evident by all the meetings we've had and listening to families and listening to all of you that it's a serious problem. But I keep hearing that a lot of it's tied federally. And when I'm given a problem, I'm kind of tenacious and I want to find a solution. And I'm trying to understand as a state, we're hearing the problems, but I'm not being able to grasp like a real concrete solution. And I know the housing is like tied to all this inflation and the economy and all that. So I want to see if we can hone in on a real solution that I can like advocate for or fight for. Also, rather than reinvent wheels, is there any other state that has mastered this problem? I would sure like to know and how they did it. So those are my questions.
Well, we actually belong to a national trade association, the National Conference of State Housing Finance Agencies. I can ask the question about what other states are doing in terms of this issue, housing for the disabled. I will tell you, I know some of the answer we just got back is that the state of New Hampshire, relative to other states, even within New England, does not put a significant amount of money into housing. And so I think part of the solution is going to be additional state resources. But if you would give me the opportunity, Senator, to have an internal discussion about what some solutions might be, because I'm just Ignatius, who runs multifamily. I work for Jack, and Rob Dappis, our executive director. And as I sit here, I represent kind of the people of New Hampshire, which is also very diverse in terms of for-profit, nonprofit developers. But I will ask the question about what other states are doing to see if we can
I
get
would
some
appreciate
information.
that because it's important we hear the problems, but I'm not getting we have to find the solution, and some of it can be legislative, but not all of it can be. So we have to figure out what else can be done. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Representative Lamontagne?
No, I forgot.
Okay. Sorry.
So just to clarify, the building cost of $350,000 to $370,000 is per unit in a multifamily.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's very consistent whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, because one of the requirements when you get our resources, you have to put things out to bid so that we know that it's competitive. Those will vary based on location. For example, a greenfield in Goffstown, for example, may cost less than an infill urban in downtown Manchester. And sometimes in the northern part of the state, it can cost more because there aren't as many construction companies. Yep. Two bedroom, yeah.
Do you have an idea of how many units are in process around the state to, I think one thing that people with disabilities have is that they have very low incomes. So it's hard for them to compete on the market. Do you have any concept of, where things are being built? Because, people with disabilities want to stay in their communities, and how many units are recently built or in process, or a need has been identified in a particular community? It's a lot to ask.
No, I think the answer is yes. I'll have to figure out whether we post that information on our website.
Okay.
They are required as part of tenant selection to give folks an opportunity to apply. It's supposed to be an open process. It cannot be a closed process. I know internally we have a list, which I didn't bring with me, of all the units that are under production with us and where they're located. But in terms of, is that something that we make publicly available? I'd have to take that back and take a look at that.
Yeah, so the reason that I ask is that I'm trying to identify, how many do we need? How many do we have coming forward, and what is the gap? And how do we address that gap? Do you have any other questions? Anyone? Okay. Representative Yokella.
With New Hampshire Housing, they have a bunch of different programs, right? I believe some of the programs that you're talking about, when you're talking about like that they're required to accept vouchers, is not just projects that you guys are kind of spearheading, but if you're financing if someone comes to you and says like, hey, I want to finance this project, is that the type of project that you're talking about when you're talking about like they have to accept the vouchers? If they come to you and say, hey, we want to finance this project, part of the stipulation of the loan is that they accept the vouchers?
Yeah, I mean, most of the folks who come to us to develop or purchase and rehab are coming to us because of our preferential financing, whether it's access to tax exempt bonds or it's capital subsidy, and all of them are required to accept vouchers.
Okay. When you're giving out the loans, do you look at or how much it is costing per unit as kind of giving them preferential treatment? Because obviously if you can get more units than your dollar, let's say you have $1 million, right? If you have projects that are $150,000 per unit versus $350,000 per unit, you're going to get a lot more units. And so I guess my question is, are we trying to get the maximum amount of units out of the dollars, the limited dollars that you guys do have? Or is it kind of just first come, first serve? Or how are you deciding which projects come first?
So everything, I'll give an answer to your last question. All of our funds that are subsidy dollars go through a competitive process, and there's scoring connected to the competitive process. We try to look at the cost, and we have some requirements. For example, we have a maximum total development cost that is based on the market and based on the information. So every time we do a development, the cost gets entered into a database on a per square foot type of project and per unit. So that's what the market is telling us. That is what the market And it's not 150. I mean, if we see something at, 300, you're like, wow, this is good. And so, yes, we look at getting scarce dollars and getting the most units. There's no question. But there are other considerations. I don't know, down in 249 Main Street in Nashua, there was, an empty space and a lot that the city really wanted to develop. And so there you're trying to help a community and you're trying to get people the ability to live downtown. But it was urban infill, which meant that the costs were higher and the like. So the answer is yes, we care about TDC. We wish we could control it more, but it's very difficult to control because the costs are based on the bid process. And TDC is one thing we look at. We look at other factors such as, are you willing to do more ADA compliant units? That's one of the factors we look at too.
I just want to the sense that I'm getting. So I understand that maybe the companies that I'm thinking about that I've seen online that have been creating like panelized housing and getting affordable housing very quickly, within like a week. They're like built, they're dried in and stuff like that. They were doing specific affordable housing projects that were in the orders of like $150,000, $200,000 for a standalone unit, not a multifamily. But I'm just wondering if we're not seeing those types of projects being proposed, maybe it's something that I should reach out to the companies that are doing that kind of a thing and say, hey, maybe you should apply in New Hampshire. And my concern though is if they did, that maybe they wouldn't have enough points if they're just being like, oh, I'm building a house, and it's just very affordable. That's not necessarily checking all of your point boxes that they would then get high on the list of funding, on the list for funding, right? If someone was specifically targeting like, oh, I'm trying to get a bunch of points so that I can get high on your guys' list. How many people that are kind of like waiting, I guess, to be on your to be funded that have a project that maybe is not very high points, but how long is their kind of wait? Or how long is that waiting list, I guess?
So we don't do a waiting list. We do
Okay.
everything on a yearly basis.
Okay.
Although this year we have awarded points under the 4% tax exempt bond program if you had a prior application that we ran out of money, so that folks don't wait. I will say, like on our 9%, which is the big production program, we had 19 developers submit preliminary applications, and that got whittled down because they need the numbers to work, and the numbers didn't work for them. And that got whittled down to, I believe it was 12, and we will only be able to award 4 or 5 projects a year on the 9% tax credit side. And we have seen panelized, and I will say for the multifamily panelized, there's certainly time savings, but I'm not sure the cost savings are that significant. So,
yeah, I've seen that. I've heard that too. In certain companies do different ways. When you're saying you got whittled down to 12, that means that there's 12 developers out there that have some property that they would like to develop housing in, but we can only develop housing in 4 of those places. and so there's, 8 places that we didn't develop? Or are you talking about, yeah, I guess that's,
Yes, and they might go from the 9%
mhm.
where they get 70% tax credit. We can work to see, can we switch them over to the 4% where it takes less capital subsidy and they get less credits, but they can carry more debt with higher rents. We try to work with folks because we want to build more affordable rental homes. That's our number one goal. But with the high cost and limited resources, all states basically follow the same, not identically the same, but the same competitive process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have, you have a, go ahead. I have a quick question. Do you know what the differential is in cost between a regular 2-bedroom unit and one with universal design?
No, but that's a fair thing for us to see. We can contact, for example, Corporation for Supportive Housing, and we can see whether they have that data. I think that's a fair question. And the issue of universal design comes up during our qualified allocation plan meetings. And I think the challenge is as a quasi-public entity trying to balance the extra cost with the unit production, because we're trying to build units, and that's obviously we're concerned about our disabled brothers and sisters. But if universal design, I don't know how much it adds. I'll find out. So,
Do you know if any of the state programs subsidize universal design in their programs?
I do not, but I think it's a fair question.
Okay. My other question is, who would you recommend that we talk to that administers these state housing trusts? Who's in charge?
So in terms
On
of
the
the
state
housing,
level, yeah.
on the state level, it's us.
Okay.
So basically, the state of New Hampshire is entitled to the housing trust fund dollars, and they have appointed New Hampshire Housing as the administrative entity for dispersing those.
Okay, so we are speaking to if we wanted, say, some of this money from the housing trust to go to universal design, would we be able to do that? Or would it have to come from one of the other state programs, like there's the Affordable Housing Trust? I know there was a whole list of them here, but in terms, you said, because HUD, you said, is limited, but you said we need to rely on state-based programs for some of this.
Yeah, and if I understand your question, it's a very interesting question. And again, I'm just Ignatius in the multifamily housing team about whether the legislature could say you shall use a percentage of your housing trust fund dollars to do it universal design. It's complicated. I mean, you're adding a layer of complexity, but it's a fair question, and I can speak internally, and we'll get back to you on that. It will mean less units, but if that's the policy decision of the legislature, that's the decision. And I don't know how the HUD. So HUD has so many, like for us to get it become the administrator, it's pretty simple. State says you administer it. Whether the state can then impose requirements on how it administer and whether those line up with the federal regs, I'm going to have to do some research on that.
Okay. The Senator?
That
first.
was my question. I felt like we'd have to legally look into this because that can be very complicated. We'd have to make sure we don't put forward legislation that we haven't, dotted all the I's and crossed the T's. And I just wonder, this may be a little bit of an ignorant question, but I'm thinking out loud. Is there a way, would it be legal or appropriate to, instead of taking these funds that are you've already mentioned, the different housing components, completely start a brand new way of doing it specifically for this issue? Like we started, the Invest New Hampshire, and then we did legislation on housing champions. And would we be able to start a whole just new funding mechanism for this issue?
So again, not just speaking as Ignatius, I mean, there already is the statute and it's like 24C 57, 24C 50,
204.
204
C
C 57, which is the Affordable Housing Fund. And if you're looking for a mechanism, that may be a mechanism where you're not creating a brand new, because every time the government creates a new approach, it adds a level of complexity to it. And I'm not speaking in favor or against this idea. I'm just providing information about that may be the mechanism if you were looking to do it.
Thank you. I was just trying to figure out like how we're going to proceed, for a solution.
Okay, we got two questions here. Representative LaMontagne and then Representative Yukela.
I just want to go back. You brought up the project in Nashua. So I'm trying to get a sense of, is it often a site that comes to you and says, we want to develop this site for affordable housing? Will you then put out the bills, start the whole bidding process and let developers know we want someone to build this?
It's a good question. So as a general rule, we're New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. The developers do that work. So in that particular case, the city of Nashua says to a developer, NeighborWorks Southern New Hampshire, hey, we have this lot, could you look into developing it? So that's the answer. I will say that there have been a few instances where New Hampshire Housing has owned land from the state, where on 95, where the liquor store was going to be, and I believe it was Hampton, we had a piece of land that we did just that. We put it out to bid, and developers put forward proposals that we then made a decision, okay, we're going to sell the property to this developer for this use. But that's not generally the way it works. Generally, the developers are in the communities and finding where to build and working with the communities on that.
And then they come to you for help with the finance.
Yes.
Okay. And Representative Yukela?
Thank you. From the housing that you currently finance, do you know how many or what percentage of the units are meet the universal design standards, if any?
Well, I can find out the answer to that question.
Okay, beautiful.
My guess would be it's probably not a significant number. To go to your earlier questions, when you're trying to control total development costs, if you go to universal design, we're going to add to those costs. And that may be a decision that's a good policy decision, but that's
Sure.
the kind of thing that we're weighing in terms of trying to build the number of units for the best cost. And I like that question. What would it cost to do universal design? And we'll try to see if we can find an answer to that question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have another question, which is something that we've been hearing a lot about vis-a-vis housing. Do parking restrictions make projects fail because they don't pencil? I mean, when we're talking about people with disabilities, if you're blind or, you may have a disability that prevents you from driving, does every unit need 2 parking spaces? And that's my question. Do you find that as a barrier to making projects pencil?
The simple answer is everything that is a requirement impacts whether the property is going to pencil out. I mean, that's the bottom line. If you're doing 2 parking units, you're consuming land, and then you're building it, and then you're maintaining it. So there's no question that the requirement of parking spaces drives up the initial cost and the long-term maintenance cost of the projects. And I believe New Hampshire Housing, and Jack may know, is more supportive of having a lower threshold of spaces per unit because we have a lot of one bedroom, we have senior housing. And if you have a senior housing, do you really need 2 spaces? All you're doing is driving up costs that aren't really adding units. So I don't know, Jack, if you have any
Yeah.
comments
Has
on
that been, has that been a problem given local zoning requirements?
Well, that issue was addressed by the Senate in the past year. I think through a bill that might have been filed by Senator Perkins Quokka, and there was a fair amount of negotiation with the towns because the towns, yes, were very concerned about, hey, you know, we want to be able to set our own parking requirements, and you know, the counter argument from housing advocates was what Ignatius just said, which is if they're unnecessarily burdensome, it creates excess costs and can actually make a project financially infeasible. So I believe that a bill was signed into law that sets a limit of 1.5 parking spaces per unit as a maximum at the local level.
Okay.
And the last thing I would say is a parking space doesn't exist in space. It exists on the ground. And a lot of the sites in New Hampshire require a lot of engineering and a lot of working to get density. And every time you add a parking space, you are impacting the ability to have density on the housing side. So
Representative Joe Keller.
I believe the bill you're referring to is HB 1400, which is a bill sponsored by Miriam Williamson.
Rebecca Williams.
Rebecca Williamson and
Rebecca
and
Williamson.
myself.
Oh,
Yes. And we negotiated to, I think it's 1.5 for, I believe it's structures greater than 10 units. I believe it's 10 units or greater or something like that, that the Senate amended the House version was, no, they're not allowed to require 2 units. Or I think it was a maximum requirement of 1 unit, and it got negotiated up to 1.5.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on the sponsorship. I think I was confused because at one point the Homnibus bill may have gotten merged with 1400 and then separated. So I didn't know how it sort of all ended up. But yes, obviously, Representative McWilliams and you yourself, Representative Yokola, deserve credit on that one.
1400, just look that way.
I'm surprised you didn't ask that question. Anyway, okay, so we have, all right. Does anyone have any further questions? I see some folks from the audience have wanted to speak, but, and you know, if you could stick around and do you have any thoughts on what we can do to encourage more housing for people with disabilities? What would be your just?
Are you asking of the audience or?
Well, I'm asking of you guys at first.
well, I guess what I would do is I would request the opportunity to have that discussion internally because of the integration of so many of these programs. And if we do, for example, universal design, what does that mean? And I can't run those numbers right now, but if you would give us that opportunity, we will provide our thoughts. Is that fair, Jack?
Yeah. So one of the benefits of this committee at Senator Ricciardi's request, we are authorized to go for another year. We'll be providing a preliminary report in early November, but then we have a full year so we can meet with people and do deeper dives into these issues. So thank you for offering that. I appreciate it. So do you have anything else you'd like to tell us? Okay. So please stay around and we might call you back up because I see that there are some people in the audience who have some thoughts.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
No, thank you for coming. And hopefully on the 22nd, we'll be hearing from some developers. New Hampshire Housing Action is working on finding some nonprofit developers to come and talk to us about these issues. So Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's great.
Okay, so if people from the audience would like to ask a question or say something, please come forward to the microphone and state your name. Bodwin.
Lisa Bodwin. I just have one follow-up question from Senator Ricciardi's question regarding the voucher program. And I'm wondering if HUD has a regulation that prevents New Hampshire from contributing to the voucher program. Or another way to put the question, is there a regulation or mechanism for New Hampshire to contribute funding to the voucher program?
That's a good question. Dee, yes. You don't think that's appropriate?
I think that in my opinion, I don't think that we would do that exactly in that mechanism. I think that what we would do if we were to do something would be to essentially earmark some money and essentially the requirements to get said grant or whatever would be that they be a voucher holder or something like that. And therefore, then that money would essentially only go to those people that had voucher. And so then you would be kind of like helping essentially that. It was also kind of something that I was thinking about as far as like if we knew the difference between the cost to build a house, is it 10% more to go to universal design or something? Maybe there was some mechanism that the New Hampshire legislature would be willing to earmark some money that would say, hey, if you had a project, we're willing to, if you have a project of, 5 units or 10 units, we're willing to put up that, half of that 10% or whatever, if you're going to make it universal design or something, and just earmark some money specifically to help incentivize the universal design, which then those units might be able to be better suited to address the disabled populations, right?
So,
So-
I guess my question, Dee,
But-
is, could the state give you money for vouchers? That's the question. Yes. And do we? Okay.
No, so it would have to be a state-run program. Massachusetts has a state-run rental assistance program. It would have to be appropriated to the state,
Okay.
sort of like the emergency rental assistance program
Mhm.
that Treasury funded a few years ago. If the state wanted to do that.
Senator?
I just keep thinking about how all these people are on these ridiculous wait lists. And I keep going back to what you said about somebody terminally ill. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I call this an emergency. This is an emergency.
I think one of the things I didn't mention is. when I
Can you
talked
come
about-
to the microphone, please? Because we're on
Sorry.
we're on
One of the
TV.
things I maybe should have mentioned when I talk about attrition, the average wait time of a voucher participant on the program is 11 to 12 years.
Okay.
So if you don't have turnover and attrition, you have a set number of subsidies by the federal government. You can't go over 4,000, or whatever the number may be. And if there's very little turnover, because once someone has a voucher, they hold on to that. And if someone has extremely low income, they're probably going to have extremely low income for 10, 12 years, unless they're working towards getting off the program or participating in some of our family self-sufficiency programs, or they're working, and they want to graduate themselves off the program. Otherwise, the length of time that someone's on the program has grown.
Follow up.
So while they're in this waiting period, this endless waiting period, where are they? What are they doing?
Another good question. We ask when they come to the top of the waiting list, we have to report to HUD if they are homeless when they get to the top. And unless that's the only question we really ask of, but most of them share or will tell us they were either, staying with friends and family, doubling up, living in substandard housing, not paying other bills to pay their rent, just barely getting by. Yeah. So unfortunately, now what we have to say to a lot of callers is the voucher is not an immediate available resource for many. It's a federal program, and that's how it is funded.
You
Go
might-
ahead, Dan.
What do you think about the idea of the state providing funding for owners of substandard housing, say? We'll provide money to rehab this if you agree to accept Section 8 vouchers, or if you agree to convert it to universal design.
Yeah,
Is there,
there have been some Home for All. Seacoast United Way had a program, something like that, where they had a certain amount of funds that they would, for landlords who would be part, I don't know everything about their program, but if a landlord wanted to be part of their program, they would give them some money, maybe for an incentive fee, for some repairs, maybe damages, mitigation fund, and in return, they would rent to a voucher holder. So that's possible.
I guess one final question that I have. Well, I keep saying that, but there are other programs like 79E, which is for downtown buildings that are underutilized, etc. Who's in charge of that? Do we know?
No.
Is it the local municipalities? But there's okay.
Yeah, there's no one in charge.
Okay.
Statewide, it's any municipality
Okay.
that's interested in developing a project that.
Can you come to the microphone, please? I'm sorry. Okay, so 79E vouchers, which allow municipalities to provide tax credits.
Yeah, so
for
RSA
people.
79E essentially is tax deferral for new projects. And recently, among the uses could be for conversion of, I think, business properties into housing, residential housing. But there's no sort of statewide program with an administrator. It is simply a tax incentive that towns may opt to apply to a given project in their own town.
Are there any prohibitions against what would need to happen for towns to include universal design as an attribute of a project that would allow the town to provide this tax incentive? Would we have to change the law? Yeah.
I don't think so, but I am not an expert in this area, and I can
Okay.
definitely go back to the office and ask someone who's got more expertise in
Okay.
this area.
All right, I appreciate that. You have some thoughts? You've worked a lot on this housing stuff.
Yeah, 79E. I think if you wanted to make some, I think that you would need to change the 79E to specifically state like, hey, you're allowed to, because it's essentially kind of like a list of things that the municipality is allowed to provide tax incentives for. And so if you wanted to add another one, then you would need to add it to 79E. Or kind of say, for example, the one that just got recently added to change commercial office space into housing, if you could say, as long as it, comma, as long or as long as it meets universal design, and that would then limit the municipality to only providing that benefit to those that were universal design. Or you could go the other way and
percent- or do
say
a
a specific, or they can do give an increased incentive to those that meet universal design or something like that. But I think all of those language changes would be within 79B.
Right, thank you, thank you. Okay, all right. Is there anything else? Are there, oh, yes, come forward.
Hi, Will Walker Hollis. Thank you very much. Thank you, New Hampshire Housing, for all the information today. Outstanding presentation. You guys have helped me a lot in my own exploration in this space. I do have one request because you guys were taking on so much already. As you were looking at the incremental cost to do universal design from building, I'm also wondering, can you do a research into what it costs to rehab a place to make it accessible? In working in software accessibility for decades, we often found that retrofitting something was far more expensive than doing it right the first time. Thank you.
Okay, one thing that I failed to do on the agenda was for us to approve the minutes of the previous meeting. They're right here. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I think I go.
Didn't get one of these, okay. Sorry about that.
I wasn't, I have to abstain.
Okay, so if we want to take a minute to do that, and I read them earlier.
I read them all from what you emailed.
Yeah.
I mean, on what is this? It's not. It's technically page 2, I guess. Under one. Wow, 1A, Roman 4, number 4, Roman 5, or maybe it's Roman 5,
Yeah,
A, or no, Roman 6, where I said, I was asking if the statistics that they were giving were for people with intellectual disabilities or just people that were just generally disabled. The answer was that they were only specifically giving us information about people with intellectual disabilities. It had nothing to do with people with physical disabilities. So I don't know if that answer was using IDD as example really
Yeah, I
is.
think I meant to get back to that, but I
Okay.
didn't have good notes on it, so, but thank you.
You'll have a recording this time to work from.
Yeah,
so that's
that would
awesome.
be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the only thing I see that jumps out. So otherwise, I'm happy to motion to approve these with adjusting that answer.
Okay. I guess I will second that. I'm allowed to second, right?
Sure, you can do whatever you want.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Signify by saying aye. Okay.
Abstain.
And one abstention from Senator Ricciardi. Okay, all right, then, if there's nothing further, I ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all right. Motion by Senator Ricciardi, second by Representative Yokella. All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay. Meeting adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.